Welcome to the 2014 Asan China Conference on Assessing China's Power. This event is sponsored and hosted by the Asan Institute and organized by the Program on U.S.-China Relations at Seoul National University. To start off today's program, I would like to invite Dr. Ham Chae-bong, President of the Asan Institute, to the stage for the welcoming remarks. Please give him a round of applause.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Asan Institute. Francois, bonjour. When did you? Anyways, thank you so much for being here. As you can see from the title, and as I can see from all your presence so early in the morning, this really is a topic of great importance, and obviously of great interest to so many people. We talk about the rise of China, but seldom, other than in terms of very rough GDP growth that Francois talks about in his paper, for instance, it's really hard sometimes to see what is the real measure of China's power in different areas. And I think our conference is very truly original in the sense that we are really trying to get a handle, a much more concrete sense of Chinese power. Mr. Ambassador, welcome. But of course, I have to thank Dr. Chung Jae-ho, who is the brain, who's the intellectual inspiration, the mover behind this whole project, and as you can see, he's going to moderate all the sessions all day long. He has absolute control over this project, and I love it when somebody has some control over these projects, and I could already see the end product of this, which will be a beautiful volume, at least one volume. This conference actually, speaking of volumes, this conference follows on our earlier Asan China Conference 2012, which was actually inspired by another participant in this forum, which is Linda Jacobson. It was her paper that made us think about China's foreign policy making, which ended up, and I'm still waiting for that volume, somebody to bring that book to me? Okay. The reason I'm touting this book is that that volume was so good that it led, I want the other version of it. 이거 말고 왜 저거 안 가져오냐고, 저 Palgrave Macmillan version. So this volume was created out of our last conference, China's Foreign Policy, and it was so good it led us to actually strike a deal with Palgrave Macmillan, and so from now on, all the volumes that we do, Palgrave actually publishes it, and I just asked her to bring the other version of it. That is, it's the same book, but now Palgrave has, we do this joint publication with Palgrave and ourselves, and this book is a bestseller. It's sold, how many volumes had it sold? It's sold, I mean, bestseller in the sense of social sciences bestseller. Of course, don't get your hopes too high, but that's, but what I'm trying to say, Dr. Chung, is that you have to do at least as well in terms of sales volume, and I'm sure we will do far better than this, given the topic, and of course, given the caliber of the intellectual power that we've brought to bear in this project. In this region, especially in our country, we are just fascinated by where China is going, and of course, myself personally, I'm looking forward to this conference to see what implications, to try to find out, of course, get a better sense of China's real power, but at the same time, what it all would mean for Korea. What does it mean? We have this fascinating evolving relationship with China, even as we speak, and we have this fascinating devolving relationship with Japan on the other hand. And but anyways, we are gathered here, I think, at a crucial moment in history where the relationship between China, Japan, Korea, and of course United States all in the mix, and North Korea all smack in the center of it. It's all evolving in directions that it's very difficult right at this moment to quite grasp. And I really hope that this conference gives me a much better handle, better sense of where things are going. But in the meantime, once again, I thank you all, especially our participants, the contributors to this volume from abroad. And once again, for Dr. Chung for putting all this together. And I look forward to this day. And as I mentioned to a couple of our participants, you're free to roam around the building and enjoy the beautiful weather you happen to bring with you as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hom. Now I'd like to invite Professor Chung Jae-ho of Seoul National University to the stage for introductory remarks. Please give him a warm round of applause.
Good morning. I thank you all for coming. Since Dr. Ham Jae-bong laid out the backgrounds for the Asan China Conference, I would like to give an introduction to this particular project. The planning of this conference began in May last year, so we already had about 10 months of preparation. And I was lucky to get a stellar list of presenters, 11 presenters, and 2 discussants particularly for Session 2, which is on China's military modernization. I will give an introduction to each speaker and discussion in the session. But in the meantime, you can refer to the bios that you have in your hand. I asked the contributors to focus on 3 themes because, as I believe, the edited volume should have a coherent framework of analysis. So I asked all contributors, paper presenters, to focus on 3 themes. That is, what happened in the last 30 years in the respective sector of each presenter. And the second aspect is the comparison with the United States. So how the power capabilities in each sector is compared with the United States. Third, how each presenter will have a prospect for China's power in each sector for 2025. So hopefully, at the end of the day, we will have a volume that will have a coherent analysis of these three themes. I would like to also add one fact, that is, although we only have 11 presenters today, but the book will have 2 more chapters. We have 2 additional contributors. Anthony Saich of Harvard University will have a chapter on China's political governance capacity. And then Professor Ann Kent of Australian National University will have a chapter on China's external adaptability. So in addition to my introduction chapter, the volume will have 14 chapters. I'm not sure about how the sales will go, but I will definitely want to have a good review in scholarly journals when the book comes out. As the planner and organizer of this conference, as well as the editor of the volume, I would like to thank the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, which is sponsored and generously hosting this conference, and also Jae-bong for giving support for this project from the outset. The volume, as Jae-bong said, will be published by Palgrave Macmillan, hopefully before mid next year. I'd like to thank the audience again for coming, and I hope at the end of the day you can get something out of this increasingly complex but undoubtedly important issue. Thank you and enjoy the conference.
Professor Chung. We will now begin Session 1 on China's economic soft power. At this time, I would like to invite the speakers for Session 1 to the stage to take their seats. Just bear with us for a few moments.
Thank you, Erin. A couple of things to administer the session. Each speaker will speak for 15 minutes, and each discussant will speak for 10 minutes. And before 2 minutes, 2 minutes before your time is up, the staff will wave the picket, just to let you know you have 2 minutes. And then after presentation and after the discussion, each speaker will respond to the comments by the designated discussant for 5 minutes also, probably less than 5 minutes. And then we'll open the floor if there are any questions, okay? So, and how many of you are using PPT this session? 2, okay. So when PPT is being shown, we all have to go down and sit in the front row, okay? So, okay. For the first session, we have 3 speakers, François Godman of European Council on Foreign Relations, and Professor Scott Kennedy of Indiana University, and Dr. Kim Han-kwon from Asan Institute for Policy Studies. And then designated discussants as Sean Breslin of University of Warwick, and Professor Zhao Sui-sheng of University of Denver, and Professor Chen Zhimin from Fudan University, Shanghai. Okay, without further ado, François.
Push here. It's on. Good. Thank you very much, Chai-ho. Thank you very much, Chai-bong, for the invitation. This is a very daunting subject, and I've been assigned, I guess, the role to run as a rabbit or as a hare in front of the group by trying to guess where China might be in 2025, at least in terms of economic power, but that's enough to warrant many mistakes. And furthermore, Chai-ho was good enough to point to me very early in the stage of writing this paper that what we were really after was a kind of comparison side by side with the US, which of course is number 1. And that of course gave me a sense of something I relish, which is on the side talking about the US as it reacts to China. But it, of course, it creates further danger in that there is now a potential to get in trouble, not only with good people, experts and observers from China, but also from the US, of course, because all of this involved a lot of value judgments, a lot of guesses. So I've tried to hedge my bets, of course, and you will be disappointed that I don't give a final answer on who will really be number 1, if that really has a meaning by 2025, but still I try to place some bets on what might happen and where this might take us in 2025. With a first remark also that indeed the point of view of third countries or observers from third countries or third regional groups matters a lot, because in part where China and the US will be even economically also depends on their relations with the rest of the world, also depends on the acceptability of some of their policies, and for China that involves the acceptability of the current economic track, which is still very much predicated when you read in China the point of view of those who think that high growth is going to continue at the same level or pretty much at the same level. That particular school almost always bases some of its predictions on external growth, on exports, and in China continuing more of a very good thing for itself, the extraordinary ride it has had on the international system, on the international market for the past 30 years. I'm referring in particular to a group of people who are not very well represented in international conferences because they're so, I was going to say uniquely Chinese, but what I really mean is uniquely tied to the system. People like Hu Angong and his China in 2030 book series, people who one may think have provided some of the background and backbone to resist the more liberal and reformist impulses in China. These people are worth reading, even though they are perhaps not as intellectually internationalized or sophisticated, because they do represent a point of view that's quite often succeeded within China. And as you will see throughout my presentation, I do place a premium from success. Perhaps being European helps me by looking at others. that we have to be careful before giving lessons on what works best. It has to be demonstrated in practice. It is clear in many ways that China will catch up with the United States, or, as I mentioned, may even have caught up already in some aspects. If we are a little bit Marxian or Marxist and leave aside the fetish of money, if somebody from another planet was to come to this earth and look at material objects, not worrying at their face value and how much they're worth, the dominance of China would already be pretty established. This is what we have on our shops, on our streets. The quantity of material objects produced by China, and more often also at least designed, or as I argue, cloned in China. I know there is a crucial difference, and innovation is a very complicated field, but I don't think you can be sectarian or theological on innovation. It happens in various ways, it spreads in various ways, and being the next best, or being the first to emulate, or being the one who destroys the leader's premium in innovation also matters, also has advantages. Well, the Korean economy and the Japanese before that know fully about that. They've gone through this path through a long period when others were saying yes, but they would not be able to break into first rank, and they have broken into first rank. So this is a consideration we should make about China. That capacity to already be number one in the world of what I call material objects, I think is important. It's reflected in trade. And again, what is most interesting to me is that as China expands its lead in a number of industries, expands the number of niches where it is active, it does so in two ways: by physically becoming number one, but also by shrinking the value of the objects it builds, therefore creating, in effect, more value for the consumer, and therefore taking on even more of a lead. That's why when I look through this paper at obstacles which everybody talks about, such as the middle income trap or the rising wage issue, or the various bottlenecks that one can see building up. I'll have a word about bottlenecks, because this is what we've heard for the past 30 years about China. There would be bottlenecks that would trap growth where it was, and the bottlenecks have always been solved up to now. But when we look at that particular version of bottlenecks, which is the mid-income trap or the rising wage trap, I find that China, precisely because it has had a model of growth that was judged unbalanced by us and not following liberal prescriptions, and probably not very sound from a short-term point of view, from a liberal or cyclical economy point of view, it has invested in a number of crucial infrastructures where the payback is very long, and therefore it still has an edge, even when salaries rise, even when the mid-income trap hits. I refer to international comparisons, for example, let's say with Russia, for example, which now has lower wages than China in many sectors, or with many African countries where theoretically there should be a price edge, but everything else in terms of infrastructure, logistics, and so forth plays against an immediate transfer of comparative advantage. That is something that is quite important, and that we should keep in mind. Another remark that I want to position for you is that the state in China, what I call the seniorage effect, of course, it is an amateur attempt to emulate the role that the seniorage effect has for the US economy because of its ability to print currency and to dominate the financial system through the fact that it is, in effect, the world's bankers. Bankers can be broke at times, but if they remain the bank and if nobody disputes that fact, they still exercise a considerable influence. So we've learned that watching the US public budget debate is not enough to understand why the US stays on top. China has a seigniorage of its own on the international system. I realize that many people say that China actually captures little value of what it produces, that there are third country production networks, and obviously Korea, Japan, Taiwan, even ASEAN, which has an edge in international trade with China, are part of that value chain. But I want to position to you that the ability to set the conditions for this by China, the ability to change the rules, and this is what they have done as they go up the chain of their innovation program, the ability which they have deployed over the past years for Zhou for exit of investment, for encouraging large state investment, for letting also Chinese individuals invest abroad, for going up the chain in terms of distribution and logistics. This is something that gives China a strategic perspective on international trade, which we should not underestimate. I know that there are loads of study which explain the limitation of Chinese firms, and we constantly get visitors from the PRC who explain themselves how unsophisticated they are about the international market, how their firms are unaware and inexperienced about legal developments, for example, inside the very complex and fuzzy European Union, one might say, with its motley of rules from the what I call the 28 provinces of the European Union. Just take a look back. This is what we've heard for the past 30 years in areas that have slowly changed and where China has vastly improved, where other Asian economies vastly improved. So this is going to be a very interesting period to watch. One issue that I put forward for question to you, and I will probably leave my presentation at that, is the issue not so much of what might go wrong. This is somewhat spelled out in the paper, and these are issues which we have in front of us just about every day if we want to hear the bad news about China's future. But what is really needed to keep the high growth going? And my own bias is a version of the Chinese mantra on putting the growth back on the domestic economy. What I try to say in this paper is not so much that there is a shift needed from investment to domestic consumption, but a shift within domestic consumption from the higher end, the 10% on 1% on top of the economy. I use gray income statistics to show that it's as big as one Germany inside China in terms of income. But the need to diffuse that growth, to give back income to the other 90%, or at least to the 60% who are urbanized, in order to create a new mandate on growth. I find that this is, perhaps not surprisingly, not very different from the dilemma that every fast-growing developing economy has today. And as a pun, and to throw open the discussion, I will just indicate that in my paper, I classify as developing economies both Brazil, which is of course emerging, but has every characteristic of a divided and unequal society with nonetheless quite a little bit of growth, and the United States itself, whose very advantage over us, over the European Union, over Japan, is its ability to remain a developing economy in spite of its achievements. And developing economies come with big income inequality and with a lot of problems. I will stop there. I've tried to answer the question. I've probably only made it more complicated, but that's, it will be for you to try and carry the ball further. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francois. Scott, your turn.
So for my presentation, do you want me to go over there?
Yes. You're using PPT, right? So we should all go.
Good morning. It's an honor to be here to talk to you today about Chinese standards power. The title of our panel is something like Chinese soft power / economic power. And I hope, one of the points that I hope to make in my work is that a lot of this is not about soft power, it's about hard power. Economics, it doesn't equal soft, and military doesn't equal hard. They're not synonyms. So, but it's a great chance to share some of my work with you. My research revolves around the question of interest groups in China from a variety of perspectives, from looking at business lobbying and policy making, industrial policy, most recently started a project on philanthropy, and then also global governance. My paper and my presentation all derive from my work on China and global governance and looking at how Chinese government agencies, companies, NGOs are all moving up the learning curve to play in this global game. I'm not interested so much in Chinese compliance with many of these areas. I'm interested in Chinese effectiveness. And how they are learning the rules of the game to promote their own interests. And that's why I was so excited to participate in this project, because this focus on Chinese power is quite consistent with my attention to effectiveness. Of course, power can also be mobilized to promote cooperation and solve public goods problems, but we know that it also is about promoting one's interests, and that's really what I've been looking at with China in all of these different areas, including what we'll talk about today on standards. My research center at IU, the Research Center for Chinese Politics and Business, has had a 3-year project on China and global governance that included 40 scholars, half from China, half from elsewhere, working on 30 projects on different aspects of global governance. All those papers are on our website. We've got a edited volume coming out, hopefully a book that I will get to. I'm not as fast as the editor for this volume, but I'm going to try to keep up. And we've done a lot of policy outreach as well. I want to focus on standards today. And this is, given that we're in Korea and it's such a high-tech society, particularly in information and communications technologies, which is where I'm going to talk about mostly today. I think a lot of the background about what standards are things that probably many of you are already familiar with, so I don't need to give you Standards 101 training, but this is an extremely exciting and evolving area of global governance in which the Chinese are participating at unprecedented levels. Now, many of you may think, well, in many ways, standards are important just for collaboration, for making a foundation for economies to grow, but the standards also can be about competition. In particular, companies seek to control standards because control of those standards can yield income through licensing of the intellectual property that's tied to those standards, and also create greater demand for their products and services. Even if you don't collect a penny in royalties from a standard that you have helped develop, if that standard becomes widely embedded in products and services, in the hardware or the software afterwards, that's extremely beneficial to your company. And so standards competitions are particularly endemic in IP-based industries, and ICT is basically founded on intellectual property. And interoperability in ICT is critical, which makes the control of the standard even more powerful because the winners in standards conflicts win almost entirely and the losers lose almost completely. In addition to that, control of standards has national security implications. I'm not going to go much into that today, but obviously it affects access to dual-use technologies and provides, if you have access, control of the standards, potentially access to the standards developers for attack rivals' infrastructure and compromise confidential information. Now, China's arrived relatively late to the standards game, but it arrived learning through the process of learning by being the target of standards wars or learning how others did this. And these three organizations played a critical role in teaching the Chinese about standards wars. Qualcomm is the world's king of standards wars. In every single phone that's here and all of our technology that's up on the stage is Qualcomm products, CDMA-based technology developed in the early 1960s, and they make money off of every single one, and they have a lot of lawyers to make sure they do. We all know about Microsoft, and I think everyone here has probably watched a DVD at some point. The shape of standards competition has evolved, and there's lots of variation. It's important to say that actually in many areas where IP is not important, competition in standards is much less obvious. And in fact, Chinese involvement in many of these areas is quite harmonious, to borrow the phrase of a former Chinese leader. And it's really in the space that I'm going to talk about in the paper today where that conflict is, and it's almost entirely in this space. And so it really is affected by the economics of the business as opposed to some particular Chinese decision to make this where they want to focus. Standards contests typically don't pit one country against another, so you can't talk about China's standards as opposed to standards from others, because the interest groups in China, like the interest groups everywhere, are divided, and these conflicts run along business coalition lines rather than national lines. Internationally, standards development has shifted heavily from being based in international state-based organizations like the International Organization for Standardization and the ITU, which still exist, but they are following behind and increasingly further behind the role of industry consortia like the 3GPP, that stands for a third generation partnership project, which is developing all of the standards that are important in 3G and 4G mobile telephony. And the participants include lots of different folks, from governments, industry, experts, but regardless of where you're talking, there's one group of people who never participate in standards making, and that's consumers. Consumers are told what the standards are, and given those choices, they don't shape the standards other than what they do when they go to the store. In how I measure Chinese involvement in standards, I use three criteria, and across all the areas of global governance I look at. The first is how well they learn the rules of the game, how skillful they are. And secondly is what the score is, what the outcome of these contests are. When do the Chinese win? When do they lose? And thirdly, look at reputation. What are others' judgments of China's skills and capabilities in this area? Today, and in the paper, I focus primarily on the first two and not on the third as much. And I think this is particularly important to focus on these type of measures. A lot of folks looking at China, trying to figure out what they do, they don't focus on the score so much, on the outcome, and I'm going to try and put a lot of attention on that. So let's first say something about Chinese skills. Essentially, there have been four periods through which Chinese have gone through a process of learning to participate in the standards process. The first, from the mid-80s, or from the 1980s to the mid-1990s, where China just rejoined standards bodies, created its own standards system, and essentially observed, and had no strategic strategy with regard to standards whatsoever. Just simply a very basic period. During this time, they rejoined the ITU, and one of the reasons they felt particularly comfortable there was a former Chinese government official, Ho Lin-jiao, was a senior person at ITU, and now is the second in command there, and by next year he'll be the number one. He'll be the head of the organization. I've met him, and I've been to ITU multiple times. They feel comfortable with him, but he's not working on behalf of Chinese interests. He just happens to have come from China, and he is like any international organization diplomat. In the second phase, China, in the wake of facing high royalty licensing fees from Qualcomm and the DVD Forum, started to see how strategic standards could be. They had their own first domestic standards war involving VCD players, a very inexpensive alternative to DVDs. They developed more technical committees and then developed an official standards strategy. The basic strategy that the Chinese government set, and this is not Chinese companies, but the Chinese government, was to promote the development and commercialization of original Chinese technologies, as well as revised foreign technologies. You've probably heard of indigenous innovation. Central to that strategy is a business model in which you try to develop distinctive standards in which Chinese companies own the IP and sell related products and collect the royalties. That is a carbon copy of the strategy of Qualcomm and the other companies which had been on the other side of the business deals in the past. And critical to this strategy is the thought that China's got a huge domestic market, Chinese government controls access to the market, and therefore they can use that in exchange as leverage to move up in this space. The third stage is when Chinese become much more involved in carrying out this strategy, creating their own industry consortia within China, limiting the role of multinational companies in these groups, and an official domestic Chinese. If you look at the white paper from the American Chamber of Commerce, the EU Chamber, they constantly complain about their inability to participate fully in domestic Chinese standards groups. And China also actively joined international industry consortia, started filing patents at an extremely high clip, and then in all of this, they've been aided by what I call global governance ambassadors. And this is every area of global governance that I can see. These people are critical. I was curious if you know which of these people are not Huawei employees. Well, the only person that's not a Huawei employee is the gentleman on the bottom in the middle. He's a vice president of ZTE. But everyone else works for Huawei, and these folks used to work for Nokia, Ericsson, and all the other large companies, and have been critical in China's moving up the learning curve. And you'll see this in every area of global governance, these ambassadors. Most recently, China has adapted and expanded its strategy. It's become much more involved on the IP side of things and using and developing that. But most of their attention in the last few years has been on the international level, building coalitions in these industry consortia, joining other national bodies. This is quite interesting. Huawei, ZTE, and others are becoming much more involved in the national standards bodies of other countries, which is a carbon copy mimicry of the strategy of Microsoft, Cisco, and others who have become deeply involved in China's own national standards committee meetings. And they've also gone to court a lot more. This shows you how quickly the Chinese have moved up the patenting in the patenting world. Let me switch now to the scoreboard. I realize I'm going on too long. And what is the results of all of this learning? Well, if you're going to try and keep score in standards, it's very difficult. Here is what would be scoreboard pyramid. At the bottom, if you would be something data you'd like to have, it's not the best data on membership and meeting attendance in standards bodies. At the very top, if you really could have, you'd want to know the location and power of China based on these standards in the global value-added chain. How have they used that to re-situate themselves? And then in between, you have a variety of measures from leadership and standards organizations and submissions of proposals, all the way up to licensing and royalties, et cetera. I would say all of these things are extremely hard to come by. This is a very difficult data problem, which I've been trying to crack. And I'll just give you a very little bit of a sign of some of this. Most of the data that we have is indirect type of measures, and they focus on Chinese participation in international standard setting. And you can see how Chinese participation has risen and is of similar levels of the United States and other advanced industrialized economies. And I've got measures here from 2008 and 14 on the number of committees the Chinese are involved in, leadership in these organizations. These are official levels. If you look at the ITU, you'll see again the Chinese have ramped up their participation in the International Telecommunications Union, and also now are involved in a lot of leadership positions in it. Let me see if I can switch to a little bit on requests for comment. So these are proposals that the Chinese have put forward, and you can see that they are higher than just about everybody except for the United States, which is still, and this is the IETF, which is the Internet Engineering Task Force, sets the rules of the road for the basic infrastructure of the Internet. This is from the very top of that, because what we would really like to have, and what I'm still waiting to get, is data on declarations of essential patents and standards. And what this shows is that China's income from licensing fees related to IP have gone up. In 2012 is $1 billion, but they expended $17 billion. And China has the worst ratio of almost every country in terms of licensing fees. I could tell you some stories that are in my paper, which is how we usually, because we don't have this macro data, usually we just go story by story, and I could talk to you about wireless local area networks where the Chinese have been trying to set the rules of the game. Basically, the story there, and I'll end on this, which is that every single time the Chinese have tried to set a unique standard that is inconsistent with existing international standards or incompatible with the alternatives promoted by other companies in other countries, they lose. There's not a single case where the Chinese have been able to force a unique standard down the throats of other companies. Not one case. And the only time that they have been able to push their own standards is when they've done so in a voluntary process in which their standard ends up being one of the alternatives available to others. And I could go into some very recent examples to show that. So in fact, what we're seeing as the Chinese become more powerful, they are reinforcing the existing rules of the game. They are supporting the status quo of the system. I've got a lot of issues with how the system operates, but they are in no way changing the established rules of the game. They are reinforcing them. Thank you very much.
Oh, we have one more PowerPoint by Dr. Kim An-kwon. So if you keep your seat, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for all scholars from every corner of the world. And also, thank you very much for audience. We will have enjoy our presentations. I'm also very happy to be one of this wonderful conference. My title is Evaluating China's Normative Power Resources. My research is more focusing on the China's soft power as well as normative power of China. The world society are getting more interested in China. Is a normative power or not? After when China got one of the G2 titles recently, probably after the 2008. China's neighboring country are more interested in how China's role in international society and how they cooperated with the U.S. and how they make public goods to the international community, especially neighboring countries in Asia, who they well learn about China's traditional roles in Asia and China's unique and prevailing cultural elements. For example, Confucian practices and the prevalence of Chinese characters. So East Asian countries especially, they are very more focusing on the China's promoting soft power as well as normative power in the 21st century. In my understanding, recently Chinese top leaders are also more focusing on China's soft power and cultural influence. The former President Hu Jintao in 2007 talked about soft power as a major factor of national comprehensive national powers. And also in 2011, he also talked about prominent strategy of advancing cultural soft power in order to strengthen national core competitive powers. While China more focusing on economic development as a top national priority, China consciously, unconsciously has made a good effort to sometimes accept or adapt itself to the international norms and standards. Our best example is the participated in WTO in 2001, and also Chinese government participated in various international organizations. Even China participated in more than 27 human rights regimes and conferences. At the same time, China gets criticized by the international society, and sometimes it defends by herself against world society's criticism. Best example is the U.S. Human Rights Reports on China annual report, and Chinese government also counter-criticized the U.S. annually at the same way. The Chinese government pointed out U.S. Racial and religious discrimination and gun violence and etc. If we see the China's historical top priority of the government has changed from revolution, economic development, and recently they more focusing on the national comprehensive power. Last month, one of the standing committee member of the Chinese Politburo of CPC, Wang Qishan, also make examples, soap operas of Korea, South Korea, and the US. And he used these two examples to explain why the Chinese government more developed cultural influence, and they have to create their own soft powers in the world society. Then we have to see what is the normative power in our discussions. To becoming a normative power is China. It's not only China's matter. Also, many scholars and experts debated on the issue of US and EU too. And it is very difficult to measure. Even the soft power debates, many scholars now, it is an ongoing debate. Can we measure soft power or not? In this research, so I'd like to attempt not to measure of soft power of China, but I'd like to see how the important factors and sources to evaluating China's normative power. We have to more focusing on what factors can be evaluate China's soft power and normative power. I use the survey polls and result, and through this result, I hope we can see the trends and perspective in the next decades of China's normative power. I'd like to see first, the soft power is more about attraction and persuasion. So I will use the data set of popularity of China in international society, and Also, I'd like to show the quantitative data set of China's sources of normative power. One is for degree of corruption. The second one is people's happiness and income distribution. The third one is democracy and human rights. And fourth one is state policies regarding the support of institution for business and entrepreneurships. But before we enter into the more discussions, I'd like to point out that these 4 indicators show kind of a disadvantage to evaluating China's soft power and normative power, because the values, ideas, and philosophies, and even those institutions are located in Western cultures. So when we talked about Western cultures, some people say Chinese ideas are not really compatible with Western ideas and philosophies. So for example, if we use these data, it is true that we can have a kind of Western-oriented evaluations. But the reason I use this data set, because the normative power and soft power is persuasive power and attractive power. So we have to see how the members of international community will got the image of China, and it is directly affected to the evaluating China's normative power. So even though there is some disadvantage to the China to evaluate this with these standards, but it is the way of to understand international society's soft power. This is the one test, but I thought I have 20 minutes, but just to show the differences of ideas between Western and China's. China has a yin-yang philosophy compared to the Western goods and evils. But the problem is yin-yang, we see this is not separated two meanings. It is always coming together, and they even mixed with each other. So when China see the world, the goods and evils always coming together. It cannot be one can win over the others. And the other one is the way of thinking, chess, the game like chess and goes. I use this test. This is not my original test. This is the psychologist, U.S. psychology Professor Levitt with this test. If you see that these three categories, 2 among 3 can be a one category. It can be dog and cow can be one category, dog and grass can be one category, or cow and grass can be one category. Just to have a short test, if you think dog and cow is a one category, please raise your hands. Okay. If dog and grass can be one category, okay, and cow and grass can be one category, okay. If the first Professor Levitt operated this test in the U.S., more than 80% of U.S. students raised their hands. They said dog and cow is one category. But same thing, Professor Qin Ya-qing, very famous international scholar in China, he used the same questions in his lecture. More than 80% of Chinese students raised their hands. Cow and grass is the one category. After I knew this test, whenever I got a special lecture, I asked the Korean students. It is really half and half. So probably South Korea people is culturally impacted by China. At the same time, we have a very westernized. Before I enter and show you my data set, we have to see what is the power and what is power in IR and what is the paradox of great powers. The power, I like Max Weber's definition, but as we know, most of scholars, they more favor it and the Dahl's definition. A has power over B to the extent that he can get B to do something that B would not otherwise do. And these definitions, the Barnett and Duval in 2005 applied to explain power in international relations, just to change it, A and B to the states. 20 years ago, Joseph Nye introduced hard power, soft power, and then later he introduced smart powers because of he explained paradox of great powers. Probably you know this one. Because the big powers cannot get what they want from the weak powers, not very easy way in the past years. So Joseph Nye defined that these great powers have been less able to utilize their traditional resources of power to achieve their purposes than in the past. The best example is the US in Vietnam and Soviet Union in Afghanistan. So he introduced soft powers. Then one of the soft powers important factor is normative powers. When we discern soft power to normative powers, probably soft power is to attract others to get what the state wants from others. And at the same time, the state's normative power is make others to accept your norms and rules and purposes. First, I'd like to see the popularity of China. How can they attract in the international society? The popularity is just among the 50 and 42 when BBC got the data set. But in 2009, it suddenly little dropped to the 39 because in 2008, after the financial crisis from the US, the Chinese government showed their assertive actions in international society. It harmed China's popularity. This is a few research centers. I show the red one is the popular. They show favor of China, and the blue one is the unfavor of the China. This is the table to show how people like the China in international society. I choose two countries to compare China and US popularity in the society because some states, they favor of the US and some people, they favor of China. But the Australia and South Korea, they want to show mutual cooperation between these two countries. This is the one from Lowy Institute. In 2006, the two countries populated almost the same, but in 2013, the US going a little up and China going down. This is data from Asan Institute from the 2010 and 2013. They show very similar lines, but the US always get over of China. I'd like to use the corruption perception index. From the 1998, US always showed a high evaluation, but China from start 3.5, last year it goes up to the 4. This is the Gini index. US already over 4, means 40 is they show their disparity and their complaint to the country is very high. China from the 29.1 to the 42.91, and they already over the 40 in year 2000. This is the freedom of the world. When US, if we see the US is 1 is the best, and 7 is the worst case. China's freedom as late is not really good. And this is the economic freedom. While Chinese economic development going up, and China's economic freedom also show the promotion of in this index. My conclusion is there is a positive way and a negative way to understand the China's normative power. The positive way now, the Chinese government has started to focusing on their soft power and normative power. But at the negative point, there is domestic matters and external matters. Now the Chinese government has ethnic minority groups problems. So now it is very difficult for show there any promotion on human rights issues. And the policy priority, they still more focusing on economic development. External matters, now the US and China economic, the strategic competition still show the Syrian and North Korean issues. The Chinese government is very difficult in terms of strategy and competition to promote human rights issues. And non-interruption policies and the lack of shared identity. Now, US and Europe show their shared identity and ideas, but China has not like extend their shared ideas and cultural influence with neighboring countries at this point. Thank you very much. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. I would like to ask the speakers to return to the stage for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all three presenters. Now is time for discussion. We have three designated discussants. I ask all three discussants to be critical but constructive and to provide comments as detailed as possible. So each discussant can use 10 minutes for their discussions. Sean?
Is that on? No?
Yeah, I think so.
Can you hear me?
There's no light on it.
Is it? Okay. There can be very few people, I think, who have such a panoramic view of Chinese politics and international relations than Francois Guerdemont, and I think we've seen that in the paper here. It's extraordinarily rich and covers a whole range of different areas. It's actually quite difficult for me to find much room to be critical, more room to be positive. So I'm just going to try and pick up on three issues that I think were raised in the paper that might lay the foundation for further discussion either here or perhaps later on today. The first one was the references that you made to the way in which Chinese production was often considered to be not particularly high value added, was producing on behalf of others, and you commented that this was nevertheless changing the nature of global production, and I think that's right, and it's something I'm going to talk about in my paper as well. But I do think it raises a little bit of an issue when we're thinking about power in the global order, and that's the relationship between states and markets, or states and companies, and the extent to which we can actually allocate power and authority to countries. And I think perhaps one of the flaws of international relations when it comes to trying discussing economic issues is its tendency to see international relations as just that, international, rather than perhaps taking a more nuanced consideration of the way in which the global political economy functions. Statistics are international in nature. They're often bilateral in nature. Global production isn't. So, for example, if you take a Dell computer, or the growth of Dell computers that are being sold across the world that say made in China on them, is that an example of Chinese power? Is it an example of American power? Is it an example of Dell's power? Or is it in fact an example of the power of Flextronics Corporation, which is an American company headquartered in Singapore, which actually does, I think, pretty much all of the designing and sources the materials these days. So I do think we need to be a little bit careful when we're trying to talk about countries and global power. Obviously, there is something about Chinese power. I'm not saying throw the whole concept out. But I do think we need to perhaps modify this by thinking in the way that companies, major companies perhaps at least share power with states, and the way in which states and these major companies come together. So I think that would be my first comment on this. The second is, what does catching up actually mean, and how useful are GDP figures? I was fortunate enough recently to be in India doing a little tour of think tanks, which was quite interesting to have a white European talking on China in India, as was pointed out to me on a few occasions. And I was watching the BBC, as one does when one's in India, when one's not watching the cricket. And they were talking about India as the economic superpower. All seemed fair enough. And then I went for a walk around Old Delhi. And the first thing that hits you is the noise, and the second thing is the volume, and the third thing, to be quite honest, is the smell. And you walk around Old Delhi and you think, economic superpower. This last time I thought that was when my taxi driver got lost in Beijing because the pollution was so bad he couldn't actually work out where he was going. So I do think we need to start. It's very difficult to come up with different measurements, but our understanding of what catching up actually means, I think we have to start thinking about what economic growth is for, what it's there for, what GDP is for. And you might end up with a situation where China does indeed, or perhaps even has surpassed the United States in terms of GDP figures. But if in the process you're creating cities that people can't live in, and people increasingly don't want to live in, then that's an interesting conception of what catching up really means. And I do wonder, and this comes back to something that's at the heart of your paper, I think, I do wonder whether we need to start rethinking some of our vocabulary of economic superpowers and economic powers with the rise of China and indeed India, because we have what somebody in India called rich countries with lots of poor people living in them. And you allude, of course, to this within your paper, and you talk about the major challenge now is changing distribution and consumption within China from different sorts, and I think that is indeed important. And we are facing a situation, I think, that we've not been in for many years in global politics, where we're looking at big economic powers, which in some ways are still, in per capita terms, poor countries that have large developmental issues. And one of the things that I think that this means for people certainly outside of China, and perhaps outside the United States as well, because I do think we have a different perspective in Europe on China. We see it much less as a threat and more perhaps of an opportunity in economic terms, is that we probably need to focus more and more on things like the upcoming Indian elections, and indeed specifically on the issues that you're talking about with the third plenum, because these are going to have massive impacts on the way in which these countries evolve as economic powers, be they global powers, be they regional powers, or whatever. Which brings me on to the third issue that I wanted to come on to. You made a very insightful comment that people looking at the demise of the United States tend to look at long-term structural issues, but people who are looking at economic crisis in China tend to look at short-term things, and in particular the growth of local debt. And of course, this is, I think that's a point that's very well made. It's very easy to look at the growth of debt since 2008, 2009, and come up with predictions for the collapse of the Chinese banking system, as a number of people have been doing, and in fact a number of people have been doing probably since about 1997. One day they might be correct. And of course the imponderable that you really point towards in this paper, and I think you come out of it quite positively, so I'd quite like to ask you how positively, is what the third plenum agenda actually means, and whether there is in some respects some potential conflict in one of the things that you've written. You point to the way in which the non-liberal financial system in China has actually been very beneficial for the state in managing to guide economic development in the way that they've wanted it to go. A banking system that has proved very good at taking money out of the hands of savers and actually allocating it to state-owned enterprises and big enterprises in many ways. The insecurity of the normal Chinese civilian who wants to save because they're worried about the future has been a source of the stability and security of the Chinese state sector in some respects. But then you point to reforms, and I think on page 22 you say the end point for China's monetary and financial reforms might be different from what people are expecting. And I'd like to push you a little bit more on where you think that end point actually is, and whether there is a potential contradiction here between what has served the system well so far apparently being the source of the problems that need to be resolved. Now, perhaps that's not what you're saying. Perhaps I'm reading things into what you're saying that aren't really there. You refer in your paper to going back to 1997 to 98 as the source of a lot of these issues. I would go back even further. I think one of the key structural issues that has been partly a cause of what's happened since 2008 is actually what happened in 1994 with the reform of centre-local financial relations and the fiscal system, and the way in which local governments today are funded, and in many ways not funded, is, for me, actually perhaps a bigger structural concern than the short-term debt. The fact that local governments seem to have been depending increasingly on selling land use rights to raise finances seems to me to be the longer structural problem, perhaps, that's more akin to the longer structural term problems in the United States than the growth of debt. And I'd just really like to push you a little bit and get your views on the extent to which this political economy that's been put in place can be reformed by tinkering. Because it seems to me that if you think in terms of the banking system, social security, local government finances, the growth in land prices, they all seem to be linked together. And personally, I find it quite difficult to see how you unlink different bits of that and now you tinker with a change without affecting the whole thing. The very final thing that I would say is Evelyn Go is sitting over there and wrote a paper that I think was called Power to Do What? Is that what it was called? And that would be my final question. I mean, if China is catching up, as it is catching up, if China does catch up, if China overtakes, to what purpose? I mean, we've just heard Scott say that the Chinese authorities are not, at the moment, fundamentally challenging the status quo, but actually reinforcing it, which I thought was a very interesting statement. Now, what does catching up actually mean in terms of the distribution of power in the global system? I mean, is it really fundamentally shaking things up? Or do you think it's really fundamentally going to shake things up? You know, what is the point with it? How does catching up actually translate into different forms of authority and power in the global order? So I think I'll just stop at that point.
Thank you very much. Switch up. It is on. When you're sitting here, you can't see the light. That's
right. And my assignment is to make comments on my good friend, Professor Kennedy's really excellent article. I learned a lot about those. I did not know you are so tech sorry, as in this paper demonstrated, especially on those high-tech information technology standard setting, which is one of very important aspects of soft power and also global governance. In fact, when I read the paper, in this paper I did not see what those big themes. Now, when you make presentations, I saw those big themes. So maybe I just make comments on those big themes you might want to bring up in this very technical paper. One issue is global governance issue. In fact, that's what you have done a lot. But this paper is a case study of how China has performed in the global governance arena. So you might want to expand that to include what you have done already on those global governance aspects to make this paper more linked to those kind of issues. People don't understand those technical issues would be more interested in. Such, that's the global governance issue. Talking global governance, two issues come to my mind immediately when we talk about global governance. One is a public goods issue. In fact, you mentioned in the paper already. For that public goods, China has for many years very hesitant to be the provider of the public goods and has been a free rider of the public goods because very often they think they were not in a position to provide them. In fact, anyone provide them, they can just get benefit. But in this very specific case you studied, in fact, it's very different from other public goods. If they don't participate, if they don't be part of the game to set a standard, they have to pay a lot. So why this is the case, I see this as two types of public goods or two types of governance issues the Chinese government has encountered in the learning process. One is what people call high politics issues, international security, military regimes type. The other is no politics, here mostly economic. here in your article specifically is a technical standard setting case. The Chinese government has been very, their involvement in the international governance started from economic arena, from no politics, financial, economic. Here is a very, very new case. In fact, the technical standard setting, which has been so understudied. You have done such big, this paper is such a big contribution to the study of China's participation in the international governance arena, because very few people have could have that knowledge. So how do you link this kind of very specific technical and also unstudied standard setting into these two categories, no politics and high politics, international governance arena? Why China has been reluctant here? One issue you have not brought up, but in fact it's not quite an issue, but in other studies of governance, it's a sovereignty issue. Why China has not been actively participated very often, they are concerned about they have to give up sovereignty. Here it's not quite a sovereignty issue. It's individual companies, really. That's why in that context, I found when you talk about China here, I thought, is it China or the Chinese companies? So that kind of distinction between Chinese companies and China could be distinguished in the context of international governance. Very often, I think the state as actor is helping the Chinese individual companies. So how to make clear distinction between the Chinese companies and the Chinese state as actor in the governance arena, that could have something you can talk about here. In fact, the trend you talk about Chinese governance on using this case I don't know how typical it is, because what you have found is China has been pretty much status quo power. China has tried very good actor, all good participant in the process, try to play by role. China has not been able to change any single international standard so far, but they have not complained that much. China has been able to do that, even though they paid $17 billion royalties, received only $1 billion royalties. But still, China, is this typical Chinese behavior? That strikes me to think of, for example, China now try to push very hard to the renminbi in the financial arena to be an international reserve currency eventually, to even talking about compete or even replace the US dollars, which is somehow non-status quo player, but this is somehow very different. And international security, international law aspect in the South China Sea, China signed international convention for the law of the sea, but China does not want to comply because it's not in their interest. So in that kind of security, even financial, economic arena, we see China somehow is different from what you studied in the technical arena. So how do you link these case studies with that big picture we are concerned about China's behavior, performance in the international governance, in both low politics and high politics arena? That's something I think should be make this paper even more valuable for people to read. And in fact, related to that question is the Chinese leadership role. You talk about individual Chinese has been in those organizations. How China could become a leader in this arena, but China in other, comparing with China's performance and behavior in other international governance regimes. And we have said China for many years tried to be a minimum contribution, maximization of their benefits. That's what we see China's behavior so far. But China has been pushed forward to play a more and more leadership role. Here, China tried very hard, and also play by role to be a leadership. So this is also very different from what we see in the Chinese behavior in other arena. So that's one issue I want to see if you can add to your paper. Second issue is what you also mentioned, but in the paper did not mention that much, but soft power versus hard power issue. Because this is a very interesting case study of both soft power and hard power. To what extent this type of China's power, or China's, you talk about effectiveness, all those things, related to soft power China has tried to establish, or to extent is related to China's hard power, how the hard power has reinforced soft power, or how soft power has reinforced this soft power in the Chinese participation in the international, try to increase its influence. So a related issue there is that what we see China has been, when China has more power, China try to use those powers. But here we see China does not have that power yet in the whole case study. So how has China tried to build those power, both soft and hard? And how, because the project John Hall mentioned is talking about 30 years, how in the future we can see those built up China power will change China behavior. Third issue here is what you talked about, measurement issue here. I found this case is fascinating of a case study, but the conclusion part, I try to figure out what you want to say here, because you try to have only those stories to tell. You don't have, you say you don't have the systematic data. But when you say those $17 billion loyalty and $1 billion they received, is that some measurement you can use? Because that's the starting point motivate China try to receive more royalties paid, less royalties. So is that number available? I think that number should be available easier than what you talked about other numbers. So if that case, use that as a measurement, is that something makes things easier? I don't know. That's what I thought when I saw those kind of unsettling and how the measurement issue you try to resolve. Other than that, another question here I have, you talk a lot about non-zero sum or zero sum game here. So this is a very typical, I think, non-zero sum game case. You have either pay or gain here. So it's how in that context talk about the Chinese talk about win-win, talk about those kind of normally we talk about economic, no politics issues are non-zero sum game. I try to figure out that I did not figure it out. That's something specific. Maybe I stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Session. Gini, your turn.
Thank you, Jeho, and I had great interest in reading Professor Kim's article. So, first of all, I think it's the perspective is very interesting because I do European studies, so I certainly had quite a number of contacts with these authors of the concept of normative power, right? Ian Manners and Zakila D. So I never thought about that we use this normative power concept in the Chinese context, right? Refer to the Chinese foreign policy, but I think that in this book chapter, and you have this chapter to look at the normative power of China, that might be interesting from the outside audience perspective, and maybe also inspiring for our Chinese ourselves. Because I think normative power is a concept that we look at norm-setting power, right? A concept maybe the Chinese not very often thought of that. And it's very European concept, right? It's either they think European norms represent the universal norms, so accepting these norms actually universally, but also accepting the European norms, right? So which means the European influence in the world. Or like a more realistic type of normative power discourse is like Zaki Ladi would say that because the Europeans have created high standard within the Europe, right? If we don't export these norms to the rest of the world, then the Europeans' business or other things would be put in disadvantage because we have high environmental standard, labor standard, cost very high. But if you don't follow our standard, that you could have a very low cost and European business would be uncompetitive. So for that real interest of Europe, Europe should export these norms towards the rest of the world. Right? So these two versions there in Europe. So I do not see really that there is something idea about that, of these both two types of normative power discourse exist in China. Right? Maybe few people talk about it, but in general, I don't see that. That China wants our norms represent the universal norms, then you should they should be exported, right? Or that's because we have these norms in our interest, and we should export them to the other side, right? But anyhow, I think this is a legitimate perspective. You could look at whether the Chinese, when we have rising power, then they have the capacity to set new norms modeled after the Chinese norms, right? So that is a legitimate question, and if you have some assessment on that, and I think would be very interesting, right? The second point is that I think this is a very challenging task because of the ambiguity, inherent in the concept, be the normative power, the concept of normative power or soft power, whatever, very different interpretations of these two concepts has been around. So very important is that I think that there are several things here, right? One is the domestic and international, right? So what kind of norms we are talking about, or soft power resources we are talking about, right? It's about those norms governing domestic affairs, or we should also include that norms governing the international interstate relationship, or at the global level, so-called the global international governance, right? So I hear Professor Kim's, your focus is still like four things. It's mostly how governing the domestic political, economic, or social system, right? So it's more domestic norms. When we talk about norm-setting things, you might have to include some like international norms regulating international interstate relations, right? So whether we should include that, that is the question you have to know. Even in those norms governing domestic affairs, so are the four norms you identified are enough, or already point out the most important normative power resources from China? because you talk about that. It's more like from the Western perspective, right? What you think might be important norms, right? So, but maybe for the Chinese, they will say, yes, on this part, judging by the Western criteria, we are poor. We're not good at. But the Chinese might feel that they might doing a better job in delivering, growth, development, right? And for that, certainly it appeals to quite some countries and people. I had once in Europe that the Japanese said that I just cannot think that the Chinese has soft power. Yes, I would say that maybe we don't have soft power over Japan, right? But the Chinese are quite popular in Africa or in some other parts of the world, right? So that is, we have to look at what are the core elements in China's normative power resources, right? Besides these four things. And the other thing is that for what kind of the nature of these norms, right? Is this the Chinese norms, local norms, to become a global norms? If you talk about normative power of China, is that the Chinese capacity to push the Chinese norms to become a global norms? Or we have other two alternatives, right? Or the Chinese capacity to defend those global norms from being replaced by others. Like what do we talk about? The non-interference of domestic affairs, or sovereignty, peaceful resolution of the conflicts, right? These are the norms actually not really set up by the Chinese, but it's universal norms, but the Chinese are trying to defend these norms because some other countries try to change that, right? In the interest of China, but also maybe in the interest of many other countries, right? And thirdly is, in a way to resist some country try to promote their national norms to become new global norms. We might call it a blocking power, China as a blocking power, right? Especially that I think in the US and Europe there's many talk about new norms, right? Maybe some norms we think are going too far, and the Chinese capacity as a core, maybe a central force, try to resist these norms to become a global norms. So I think that we have to think about that. Thirdly, if I have 2 or 3 minutes, I would say that, is, as I said in the very beginning, maybe the Chinese just have no intention to become a normative power, right? So you have to look at the Chinese discourse on that. I think that there's 3 concepts here. One is so-called normative power. We studied normative power, but mostly take it as European, thing, right? Soft power. The Chinese talk a lot about soft power. It's very popular. I said that Joseph Nye is more popular in China than in anywhere in the world, right? Because the Chinese writing on soft power is so much. And third is the Chinese expression of this word. We call it 软实力. 软实力, sometimes you can translate into soft power, right? But literally speaking, it's more about soft capacities. So it does not say a lot much about the purpose of using that resource. And I think for the Chinese, it's not really like the idea, soft power is your capacity to let others to want what you want, or as an instrument to let others to follow you, particularly follow your leadership. Right. So soft power is, I had another previous article discussing the purpose of the Chinese power. Right. So mostly it's trying to defend its own kind of interests, right? Rather than try to use that to shape the outside order, right? So soft power is a way try to cultivating more cooperation with other countries to prevent others to taking more hostile policies towards China, but not so much is try to shape a China, a cynic, what do you call it, a pax sinica, right? So for that part, I think it's maybe you could also look at. Finally, it's about literature. Two kinds of things. One is that there are several Chinese authors have already done studies comparing Chinese and American soft power. So you may have look at them, how they think about that. And other is that whether we can have a ranking, when we compare with the China and US, but at the same time, whether we can also compare China with other countries. I noticed that Ernst and Young, they made a power ranking, soft power ranking. So you may have, they have 10 elements, and then to look at how these countries featured well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Before I ask the presenters to respond to the discussants, I would like to throw in some of my own questions as the editor. First, regarding Francois, three questions and comments. First, I definitely understand why you are a bit defensive as to giving out the end point or end game. But nevertheless, I'd like to push you further because many of people in the audience would like to hear, where China's economic power will be, or what it will look like. There are so many different versions. Some people say, China will surpass Japan. China surpass U.S. in terms of GDP, overall GDP by 2017 at the earliest, or 2019, 2022, 2025. So then my question is, which version would you think your prospect is closer to? That's my first question. Second question, one interesting section in your paper is about frontiers, although it's very short. So I hope you can use this time to elaborate on how these frontiers, like 中部崛起, 振兴东北, 西部大开发, how these developing frontiers will play out in actually enhancing China's economic power. The third one is, a couple of years back, we all thought 8% was the critical watershed, below which China will have enormous unemployment and something will happen. But now we are happy with 7.5%. A lot of people say it will even go down to 7%. So is this simply a myth? And then, are we looking at 7% as another myth in the coming years? Those are my questions for Francois. And as for Scott, basically you were saying two things. Standard contests do not pit one country against another. Much of it is actually based on industry consortia. But at the same time, this book is about China's power as a national power. I wonder whether you can actually frame or shape the whole paper into a more of a country's power rather than industrial thing. Second is the closely related to the first question is, even though it's industry, there must be an origin, right? Technology originates from at least one country. And royalties belong to certain corporations based in one country. So those two can be interesting indicators, to me at least, to show a country's respective or relative standard-setting power. I wonder whether participation at the table 1 and 2 that you show in the paper, I'm not quite sure whether those are more effective indicators compared to, let's say, the royalties collection or the origin of the original technologies that belong to each country. So that's the question to Scott. Finally, to Han Kwon, two questions. Well, actually, one comment and one question. soft power is a very elusive concept. My own operational definition is threefold. One is normative dimension, that is norm setting ability that Jimin talked about. Second one is standard setting power, which is not really hard power, which is not really an economic power. And third one is emotional power, or some people say attraction. In Chinese, it's all called 规范力, 标准力, and 魅力. So all these different dimensions belong to a very broad concept of soft power. And I hope you can bring out your own operational definition in your paper. That's my one comment. And one question is, you have chosen 4 indicators, World Bank, Freedom House, and so on and so forth. But you don't really say outright why you chose these 4 as opposed to others to show China's soft power. So I hope you can elaborate the rationale of selecting those 4. So this time we go in reverse order, Han Kwon first.
Thank you very much for wonderful comments and questions. First, to the Dr. Chen Zhimin. You're right. Actually, the normative power, concept of normative power comes from European the debates. And it is the standard and the norm setting and how they evaluate normative power in Europe. But it is, as you pointed out, it is very difficult. The US and European standard and evaluating the standard apply to the China. And as I mentioned earlier, from the China's perspective, it can be a kind of disadvantage to be evaluated by Western scholars and institutions. But the problem is that, the point is that the normative power is not how they defend or how they assert to the international society. The point is how the members of international society see the China's legitimacy, as you pointed out, and popularity and attractiveness. So I used the internationally respected international organizations' data not to evaluate the current Chinese normative power or soft power, but to just show quantitative data, how the current trends and how it will change in the 10 years later. Of course, I most of agree with your point that this is too early to evaluate the China's normative power. But now the international society requested to China as well as the US to be show leadership and produce or provide public goods to the international community. That's why the members of international society are very interested in how the China will promote their normative power. I will revise my paper with your comments and questions, especially how the Chinese by themselves defense of the normative power to the outside of the world, and also how the Chinese scholars think of the outside evaluate of themselves toward themselves. But one thing I have to mention about it, you're right. The Chinese scholars translated soft power to the Ruan Shili, and the one is in my understanding, is Dr. Wang Huning. Now he's the member of the Politburo of CPC. If he understands very well about soft power and normative power, probably according to his position in the CPC. In the future, the Chinese government probably more concerning about the soft power and provide more public goods to the international community. The second one is about editor's request. Yes, I use 4 indicators because there are very few data that can be internationally recognized and got the authorization. And I used the 4 categories. Of course, it is not perfectly understand how the China's normative power at these times, but just I attempt to show those factors to be show trend of the current China's the normative power resources. This is one of my hard work to discern soft power and normative power. When I started to write my paper, one of the editors request is that more focusing on normative power rather than soft power. So today I got more. I have to establish my own definition of normative power, as the editor said. I will do it in my revised papers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sui-Sheng, for your comments. And I'll just briefly have a few replies now, and then I just need to think a lot more about what you suggested. Those are all really helpful. The issue of sovereignty and the role of the state versus role of the markets. In just about every area of global governance, this has always been contentious for the Chinese, because from the Chinese government's perspective, they feel much more comfortable in state-based institutions. But an increasingly important segment of global governance is private governance. And in standards, that shift has put Chinese industry at a disadvantage. But China's leading companies like Huawei and ZTE and China Mobile ran ahead of the Chinese government without their approval, without their knowledge, without their understanding of what they were doing. And Huawei essentially pays almost zero interest in the domestic Chinese standards settings anymore, even though that's an important part of Chinese government strategy, because it's recognized that it's really not very important anymore. But that's something that's a tension in every one of these areas. Where does standards compare to other regimes? Despite the fact that I show that it's a mixed picture, standards is one of the areas where the Chinese are most influential compared to other places. Standards is what I call a producer-oriented regime. The rules of the game are entirely developed and defined in order to help producers. They're not meant to help consumers or investors or any one of us. And in those types of producer-oriented regimes, the Chinese have moved up the learning curve much more quickly. So another example would be in trade remedies, where the Chinese have learned the rules of anti-dumping at the national level and how to participate at the WTO pretty effectively. And standards is very similar to that. If you look at the other side of what I call consumer-oriented regimes that are designed mainly to constrain industry for the benefit of others, like environment, labor, competition policy, the Chinese haven't moved up the learning curve as far at all in every one of those. It's hugely, it's a very large difference. In terms of hard versus soft power, I think most of China's influence to date is about using their hard power. The fact that they can give or deny access to their market if others don't help. China's at the table in all these committees, and it's not Vietnam. It's not other smaller countries. It's because they're big. China's one of the 6 core members of the World Semiconductor Council, even though their domestic semiconductor industry is horrible, because they're China, right? And they make no positive contributions to the World Semiconductor Council, but they get a seat at the table, just from somewhere else. In terms of the data issue, which both of you raised, this is huge. So I've collected lots of stories by interviewing folks, and I can go through all those things. But yeah, you would like more macro data, comparable data, something that's less idiosyncratic. And it's extremely difficult to come by. There was an article in 2003 in World Politics, which is the only important article in IPE journals on standards, at that level in the A journal, by 2 scholars, and their data, if you want to call it data, was they did a survey of companies and their interest in standards. Not whether they actually participated, not whether they contributed to standards, not whether they got any licensing royalties, not where they stood in the global production chain, just if they were interested. And by that, they drew conclusions and they got it in that journal. I think that's horrible. So, but that is the low standard at which we operate now. So I've got potential access to a new database that's being created on the declaration of essential patents to standards. And this is all very difficult because if you look at standards meetings, you get thousands of proposals, and it's very difficult to tease out what finally was adopted, where it comes from, who it originates from. It's very, very difficult to do that. And then even once you do that, actually figuring out how that translates into royalties and licensing and other things, the system isn't constructed that way. And it may be intentionally murky and opaque, but I realize that if we don't do something, then it will be less effective of a paper. So I'd like to be able to do that if I can. So I appreciate all of those suggestions and the other ones, and I'll take them all into account as I revise. Thanks.
Thanks a lot to Sean and also to Jai-Ho for very powerful comments that in fact expose some of the ambiguities and hedging in my paper. On the way here, I read a joke on the plane that if you ask 5 economists for opinion on the future, you'll get 5 different opinions, except if one of them is from Harvard, and then you might get 6 opinions. I only studied a year at Harvard, so I'll try to stick to the 5 opinions. When will China really catch up? If it's PPP GDP aggregate, of course, not per capita, I think that's already the case. I believe Subramanian, and I also believe it because there is a vast interest in the Chinese system in actually understating, not overstating, the actual figures for a number of reasons. Some of them have to do with the internal economy, with the gray economy and the vested interest there. Some of them have to do with the bargaining relation with the outside world and with what is, I think, a very strong tenet in my paper, that they absolutely want to stick to the status of a developing economy for as much as they can last. By the way, even Korea is still classified in international terms, for, at least for a climate and environment perspective, as a developing economy, even though it's clearly not a developing economy. But so it shows how these things are strategic. If we're looking at the other extreme at PPP GDP per capita, my answer is never, ever. There's just no way. The constraints on resources, the inborn advantages of US society. And that brings me right to something that Sean said. I will come back to him. Yes, you actually live happier in zero growth or nearly zero growth Japan, or perhaps Taiwan, which is in between, than in China or India with high growth. Every happiness index would probably indicate that there is that the economic growth does not translate into other measures. Nonetheless, since our criterion was power, we have to consider the absolute criteria. 8%, the watershed, the myth about growth. Personally, every time I see now Chinese growth slowing down, I become more optimistic, not less. Chinese growth, as former Premier Wen Jiabao said, needs to slow down for another longer burst of growth. Less steel, less coal, less real estate deals, less, as I write somewhere, roads to nowhere from public investment. That's a plus, actually, even if it translates into less GDP growth in the short term. If we consider 2 things, one, as some finance officials have recently said, they still have something under the hood, so to speak, to speed up growth if they need to, that is, they can inverse some of the measures that they take. And 2, if we see something happening, something else, if we see a positive side of reform. That's where I answer Sean's question on the 3rd plenum. I'm pretty much convinced by what I'm beginning to see on the banking sector, on the distribution, on private firms. I was very much struck, for example, by the emergence of a company like Alibaba, not only as a distributor, but also as a banker, and others would follow suit. I write somewhere in the paper that this could be the beginning of a revolution, such as the revolution that broke up the collective system in agriculture in 1981. And of course, this doesn't happen without the state. So I come to your other question, which is, how power of the state or power of companies is it different? The chairman of a major internet company whom I listened to recently, of a Chinese major internet company, asked about that very question, answered with a joke saying, we're in bed with the state, but we're not married, which I think was a very honest definition of the relationship of private and public sector, a bit different from what is usually played out, which is that we have two antagonistic forces. One is the SOEs, completely identified to vested interest in the state, and private interest, which we see, as budding bourgeois Democrats struggling against the system and waving the flag of the market. The reality is in between. You see it more and more abroad, and that brings an answer from a tentative answer to your third question, which is, in the end, are they converging, or do they want to converge? What is the converging point? Are they reforming? Will they bring, for example, full capital convertibility and full internationalization of the currency? And my guess is no. My guess, and it's very close to what you write yourself, on being on the margin of the system, of perhaps hollowing out, you don't write it so clearly, hollowing out some of the international system, but depending and banking on it in other respects, certainly not aiming to challenge or to replace it. My guess is that they will try to reform, revamp this development model, but stick to it for as long as they can. And even in today's internationalization of the currency scheme, I noticed, for example, that Zhou Xiaochuan and his colleague no longer set deadlines. It's no longer popular to say, 5 years. The bankers, everybody loves it when you can say this is going to happen soon. They're not saying it. I think they are much more cagey. We have a long-term view that is emerging of China with its own economic path. It is true that strikingly, and as Professor Chen Zhemin said, they are not very ambitious in terms of norm setting, in terms of model setting. Only the archaic sector, shall we say, of Chinese public intellectuals really hypes a Chinese model internationally. All the others are interested in some form of integrative model, but integrating is not the same as being under an international model. And I think throughout what I try to write about the future, things will be decided by the state with a superiority of the state. I come back, final word, to the comparison for 2025. A lot of it is going to depend on China's currency policy, on the valuation of the currency, because in a flash, if the currency was reevaluated, we would get all these figures in, and China would become number one in the global economy. But my guess is that they will not want that. I'm particularly struck by what is happening now, which is the lower yuan. Polemically, they will say, well, the yen, even the won. In fact, we're only doing what others are doing. But I think deep down, it is part of easing the transition and the reform by making easier terms for China's traditional model of export. B, delaying the moment finally when they have to adjust to an international market, saying, hey, you're the big kid around the block, now you need to change the rules and give up the status of a developing economy. And there.
Thank you very much. The time is up. Everyone must be starving. So the session number 1 is adjourned. Hopefully in the session 2 and 3, we'll have some time left for flow discussions. So session 2 will begin at 1 o'clock. So after lunch, I hope to see you all again here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.